Hey there, my name is Gabby and I'm a climate activist here in Miami, Florida. I'm 20 years old, I'm a college student, and I'm also a climate change educator. Growing up, I grew up really fascinated by the natural environment. Here in Miami, we have mile-long beaches, the Everglades, and the most beautiful mangroves. And so I really fell in love with science while I grew up, and now I study environmental science in college. And as I learned more about the environment, I learned about our relationship with it and why humans were destroying it at such unprecedented rates. I took it upon myself to educate my community about the individual actions we could take to help protect the environment. Things like eat less meat, carpool with your friends, which are all great. But then I learned about the climate crisis. In Miami, the climate conversation pretty much focuses on sea level rise. As our land ice is melting and our oceans are expanding, the waters are rising really rapid here in Miami. But sea level rise is not our only threat. Every fall that comes around, our hurricane season gets worse, and every summer, our days get even hotter. And so what's even worse is that Miami has a very bad environmental justice issue. So not everybody's going to feel the impacts equally, and not everybody will be able to get up and leave if we need to. In fact, by 2050, 1/3 of our year in Miami will be above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll be 51 years old. And so as I started realizing all of this, I realized that this was not about saving the planet anymore. This was about saving ourselves. This was about saving my home. This was about saving the future of generations. And if I really wanted to make a change, I needed to do more than I was doing before. As I got involved with the Clio Institute, I became involved with climate change education and activism. And I didn't really know much about activism. I didn't know much about local government. I didn't know what it meant to be politically engaged. I just knew science, and I knew educating people and talking to them. But deep down, I knew that I needed to be and do more. And so I became an advocate for clean energy and for climate justice. In November of 2019, the city of Miami was going to vote on passing a climate emergency declaration. Me and other student activists went there so that we could ask Miami to do this and to commit to carbon neutrality. And after I got up and spoke in front of the mayor and the commissioners there, moments later, they voted on it and it passed unanimously. That feeling and that moment and that win really solidified to me that activism works. I saw it work. And to me, activism also comes from education. I'm also a co-host of a podcast powered by the Clio Institute called House on Fire. It's a youth-led podcast about the climate crisis. Due to the pandemic, we've had to pause on recording and postpone our launch, but we're launching really soon. So please go follow us on Instagram at House on Fire Podcast to stay tuned. Knowing that I'm going to lose my home due to the greed of just a few people doesn't sit well with me. We've had many wake-up calls in the past few years, but I really think this pandemic is the biggest one so far. There's no better time than right now to unite behind science. As long as we keep our heads in the sand, the water will rise. Thanks so much for listening, and happy Earth Day.
Hi, I'm John Paul, otherwise known as JP, and I'm a 17-year-old high school senior and Miami-based organizer working with a coalition of local and national climate action-based groups, one of them being the Clio Institute, which I love. My story with activism, I guess, begins in my childhood. Growing up in a tropical place like Miami, hurricanes were routine, and we experienced them pretty much every year. But something changed in my sophomore year of high school. Miami was faced with the impending Hurricane Irma, and this was a storm that we'd never seen before. I mean, overnight, this storm grew very powerful and intensified all the way to a Category 5. And Miami was facing what seemed to be an apocalypse. In order for my mom and I to sort of reduce the risks that we face, we stayed with a more affluent friend that had more safety resources. And luckily, the storm, as powerful as it was, changed its trajectory and merely brushed over Miami. But despite this, the destruction was felt. When my mom and I left this friend's home and headed back to our own home, we noticed that predominantly it was low-income communities of color that were ravaged by this storm. And I'd always understood climate change from a young age, and from the bit of education that I had received on the subject, that yes, it would wield destruction upon the environment and it would make hurricanes more intense. But for the first time ever, because of this event, I was able to realize that the climate crisis is not only just an environmental issue, it is one of justice. And that's when I felt my calling. A year later, the IPCC released a report that we had 12 years to drastically change how we live and how we did things in order to prevent catastrophe that was irreversible. And in the face of the inaction that I felt civically from my community, I took it upon myself to try and empower people and have them see what I saw after this hurricane, that message of climate justice. And facing possible repercussions, I decided to plan a walkout at my school. And to my surprise, when it happened, I didn't face any repercussions, only solidarity. About 250 of my peers walked out with me. And for the first time, as we voiced our demands in powerful trembles, I felt that I had power. I felt that we as a generation, against the interests of a few people who, create so much profit from stealing our futures, have power. And that's what led me to the Clio Institute. When I found the Clio Institute, they received me with open and loving hands and were ready to provide me with a platform to voice my call for action. And that manifested itself with the amazing climate strikes that we were able to plan, but also by creating this youth-led climate podcast known as House on Fire, which I co-host today. And through my efforts at the Clio Institute, I am still trying to uplift and educate all the voices of my frontline community to ensure climate justice for all. Now, our podcast, because of the current situation with COVID-19, has undergone a bit of a setback. However, if you want to stay updated with our podcast, please visit www.clioinstitute.org/house-on-fire. Thank you.